If we know of two different heritable traits, one of them being dominant, the strong one, and one of them being recessive, the weak one, we can use a Punnett square to help predict what the offspring will look like from two different creatures with these heritable traits. Let's take a look at how that works. For our example, we are going to use an imaginary creature called the Freaky. Now, the Freakies have fangs that point downwards most of the time. That is the dominant trait. The teeth that point downward, those big fangs. But then, there's another kind of Freaky. Every once in a while, you see one with fangs that point upward. That is the recessive trait. So in our example, we're going to use an uppercase T to stand for the dominant, strong gene for the teeth that point downwards. And we're going to use a lowercase t for the recessive or weak gene for the teeth that point upward. Whenever you're doing a Punnett square, you use capital and lowercase letters to represent the dominant and recessive genes. You can use whatever letter you like. I use T because we're talking about teeth, but it doesn't really matter which one you use. You can figure it out using any letter you decide on. So I'm using uppercase T and lowercase t. Let's see how that works out. Let's say we have one Freaky that has two dominant genes for the downward-facing fangs. And then our other Freaky is going to have two recessive genes for the teeth, the lowercase t. Whenever a Freaky has even one dominant gene, the uppercase T, you will always see that it has downward-facing fangs because that gene is dominant. The one that we're using in our example has two genes for the dominant trait of downward-facing fangs. So T and T. They got one gene from the mom, one gene from the dad. This one got a dominant gene from both, so it definitely has downward-facing fangs. The other Freaky in our example has two recessive genes, two lowercase t's. Remember, if even one capital T shows up, if even one dominant gene is there, it will always show as downward-facing fangs. But this one has two genes for the recessive trait, lowercase t, lowercase t. Two recessive genes for the upward-facing fangs. That's the only reason why this one has upward-facing fangs, because it has to have two recessive genes for that to show up. And it did. So let's see what would happen. What kind of babies would they have if a Freaky with two dominant genes had offspring with a Freaky with two recessive genes? Let's take a look at our Punnett square and see what happens. First, you're going to write the genes from one parent on this side of the Punnett square. The first Freaky had two dominant genes, uppercase T's, so we're putting them here. 1, 2. Next, on the top, you write the two genes from the other parent. That one had two recessive genes for upward-facing fangs, so they go here, TT. So each of these four squares is going to represent one offspring if these two Freakies reproduce together. Offspring number 1, the first baby, would get one dominant gene from the one parent and a recessive gene from the other parent. Remember, I said anytime there's even one dominant gene, that's what will show up. So this first offspring will have downward-facing fangs, the dominant trait. Let's look at the second one. The second offspring, same thing. One dominant gene from parent number 1, one recessive gene from parent number 2. Again, it's a mix, a dominant gene and a recessive gene. The dominant one is the strong one, so it blocks out the recessive gene. This is another baby that will have downward-facing fangs. Next offspring, Look at that. It's the same thing again. One dominant gene from one parent, a recessive gene from the other. This baby will have downward-facing fangs. Can you guess what's going to happen next? The next offspring is going to have, yep, you guessed it, a dominant gene from one parent and a recessive gene from the other. It's a mixture. Anytime there's even one dominant gene, that's what shows up. So this is another offspring with downward-facing fangs. Every single one of them have downward-facing fangs. Look at that. You know what that is? You know what that is? It's freaky. Important note. The example we looked at here is only one possible combination. Freaky parent number 1 had 2 dominant genes for teeth. Freaky parent number 2 had 2 recessive genes for teeth. But as we saw, all the offspring had downward-facing teeth. They all look like the one parent with downward teeth, even though they each have one recessive gene for upward teeth. That's because the gene for downward-facing teeth is dominant. So, what if 2 of that kind of freaky reproduced? Since they each have one dominant and one recessive gene, what do you think their offspring would be like? If they had 4 babies, how many of them would have downward teeth, the dominant trait? How many would have upward teeth, the recessive trait? We'll take a look at that some other time. Yeah, that seems like a good price for jeans. Look at those so cute, the little rabbits on there. Hey, Mr. Walsh, I'm buying some jeans for myself on your Amazon account, okay?